Hey there, sleepy historians. Tonight we're embarking on a journey that's about as thrilling as watching paint dry on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. We're diving deep into the absolutely riveting world of early 17th century maritime transportation, specifically how a group of extremely determined and somewhat cranky religious separatists managed to cram themselves into a wooden bucket and sail across an ocean that really didn't want them there. So before you drift off into dreams of hardtack biscuits and scurvy, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of nautical misery, and subscribe if you want more historically accurate bedtime stories that'll have you snoring faster than a Puritan at a Sunday sermon. Let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and what other boring historical topics you'd like to hear about. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably all desperately seeking something dull enough to cure their insomnia. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together across the choppy waters of 1620. Picture this. It's September 1620, and you've just made possibly the worst travel decision in human history. You're standing on the deck of a ship called the Mayflower, which sounds romantic until you realize it's basically a floating wooden box that smells like unwashed humanity mixed with rotting food and despair. The ship is 180 feet long and 25 feet wide, which sounds spacious until you remember that 102 people are about to spend the next 66 days trapped inside it together. That's less space per person than a modern prison cell, and at least prisoners get visiting hours. The Mayflower wasn't even supposed to be a passenger ship. It was a cargo vessel designed to haul wine and other goods across much shorter distances. Using it to transport families across the Atlantic was like trying to move your entire household in a shopping cart. Technically possible, but guaranteed to be miserable for everyone involved. The ship had 3 main levels: the gun deck, where most passengers would spend their time, the cargo hold below, and the upper deck where you could go if you wanted to get soaked by freezing seawater or blown overboard by Atlantic winds. The passengers, who would later become known as the Pilgrims, though they never called themselves that, were a fascinating mix of religious separatists and regular folks just looking for a fresh start. About half were members of a Puritan sect that had been living in exile in the Netherlands for over a decade. They called themselves saints, which tells you everything you need to know about their humility levels. The other half were simply people seeking economic opportunity in the New World. The saints called these folks strangers because apparently, even on a crowded ship heading into the unknown, there was still time for social hierarchies and mild condescension. The journey began not in England, but in the Netherlands, where the separatists had been living in the city of Leiden. They'd originally fled England because they believed the Church of England was too similar to Catholicism, and they wanted to worship in their own particular way without interference from bishops or kings or anyone else who might have opinions about their spiritual practices. After 12 years in Holland, they decided that Dutch culture was corrupting their children, who were learning to speak Dutch and maybe enjoying themselves a little too much for proper Puritan comfort. So they made the brilliant decision to pack up their entire community and move to a completely untamed wilderness on the other side of the world. Because nothing says good parenting like dragging your kids to a place where winter can kill you, and the local population has every reason to be suspicious of uninvited European visitors. The preparations for this journey were about as organized as you might expect from a group of people whose primary qualification was religious fervor. They needed money, lots of it, and they found investors in London who were willing to fund the expedition in exchange for 7 years of indentured servitude from the colonists. Essentially, the Pilgrims sold themselves into temporary slavery to pay for the privilege of nearly dying at sea and then probably dying on land. The financial arrangement was complicated and would cause problems for years to come. The colonists would work for the joint stock company, sending back lumber, furs, and other valuable goods. After 7 years, they would own their land and homes outright. In the meantime, everything they produced belonged to the investors. It was like a very expensive, very dangerous rental agreement with a wilderness. The Mayflower itself was chartered from Christopher Jones, a ship captain who probably thought he was getting a straightforward cargo run across the Atlantic. Instead, he ended up responsible for the lives of over 100 people, including dozens of children, on a journey that would test every limit of 17th century maritime technology. The ship was sturdy enough, built with English oak and designed to weather storms, but it was never meant to be a comfortable home for 2 months at sea. Before departure, the passengers had to squeeze their entire lives into whatever space they could claim in the ship's hold. Each family was allocated an area roughly the size of a modern parking space, and in that space, they had to fit not just themselves, but everything they owned and everything they thought they might need to start a new life in America. Tools, furniture, clothing, food, books, and personal possessions all had to be carefully packed and secured for a journey that would involve constant motion, frequent storms, and the very real possibility that the ship might sink at any moment. The loading process took weeks, and it quickly became apparent that there simply wasn't enough room for everything everyone wanted to bring. Difficult decisions had to be made. Do you bring the good dishes or extra blankets, the family Bible or additional tools? Many families were forced to sell or abandon possessions they'd hoped to take to America, creating an emotional burden before the journey even began. Food was another massive challenge. The passengers had to bring enough provisions to last not just the sea voyage, but also their first months in America while they established farms and learned to hunt and fish in an unfamiliar environment. The ship's stores included barrels of salt pork, hardtack biscuits that were already stale when they were packed, beer because water spoiled too quickly, dried peas and beans, cheese that would grow increasingly creative varieties of mold, and various preserved meats of questionable origin and an even more questionable palatability. The beer deserves special mention because it was considered safer to drink than water, which was absolutely correct given 17th century sanitation standards. Men, women, and children all drank beer as their primary beverage, though the ship's beer was weak stuff, barely alcoholic, and tasting roughly like liquid bread. Still, it was better than drinking water that had been sitting in wooden barrels for weeks, developing its own ecosystem of bacteria and microscopic wildlife. Personal hygiene during the voyage was essentially non-existent. There were no bathrooms on the Mayflower, just a few buckets that served as communal toilets and were emptied overboard when weather permitted. When storms made it too dangerous to go on deck, well, the smell below deck became truly legendary. Passengers wore the same clothes for weeks at a time, and bathing meant occasionally wiping yourself down with a damp cloth if you could spare the water. The sleeping arrangements were perhaps the most challenging aspect of daily life aboard the ship. Families strung up hammocks or spread blankets on the hard wooden deck, trying to create some semblance of privacy in a space where privacy was impossible. Children cried, adults snored, and everyone was constantly bumping into everyone else as the ship rolled and pitched through Atlantic swells. Sleep became a precious commodity, grabbed in brief moments between the sounds of creaking timbers, shouting sailors, and fellow passengers dealing with seasickness in various unpleasant ways. Speaking of seasickness, it was absolutely unavoidable for most passengers. The Mayflower's motion was constant and unpredictable, and very few of the passengers had any experience with ocean travel. The ship would roll from side to side, pitch forward and backward, and occasionally do combinations of both that would leave even experienced sailors feeling queasy. For people who had never been on anything larger than a river barge, the sensation was overwhelming and persistent. The ship's crew, led by Captain Christopher Jones, were professional sailors who knew their business, but they were not particularly sympathetic to the passengers' discomfort. The crew had work to do, keeping the ship on course and maintaining the rigging and sails, and they had little patience for landlubbers who couldn't keep their meals down or who got in the way during crucial operations. The relationship between passengers and crew was tense from the beginning and would only get worse as the voyage continued. Navigation in 1620 was still more art than science. Captain Jones had a compass, charts that were reasonably accurate for well-traveled routes, and methods for determining latitude by observing the sun and stars. But longitude remained a mystery, so determining exactly where the ship was on the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean was largely guesswork based on speed estimates and compass headings. If the weather was cloudy for several days running, which it often was, the ship's position became increasingly uncertain. The Mayflower was supposed to be accompanied by a second ship called the Speedwell, which would have made the journey somewhat less crowded and provided backup in case of emergency. But the Speedwell proved to be unseaworthy, leaking badly and requiring repairs that delayed the departure for weeks. Eventually, the decision was made to abandon the Speedwell entirely and crams all the passengers onto the Mayflower, making an already challenging voyage even more difficult. This delay had serious consequences beyond mere overcrowding. The original plan had been to arrive in America during the summer, giving the colonists time to build shelters and establish food sources before winter arrived. Instead, the departure was pushed back to September, meaning they would arrive just as the harsh New England winter was beginning. This timing would prove nearly catastrophic for the survival of the colony. The weather during the crossing was typical for the North Atlantic in autumn, which is to say it was frequently terrible. Storms would arise with little warning, turning the ship into a roller coaster that never stopped moving. During severe weather, passengers were forbidden from going on deck, leaving them trapped below in darkness, breathing stale air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and worse. The ship would climb enormous waves and then crash down into the troughs, sending loose objects and people sliding across the deck in dangerous, chaotic heaps. Between the storms, daily life aboard the Mayflower settled into a routine that was monotonous, uncomfortable, and occasionally dangerous. The passengers woke each morning to the sound of the ship's bell and the shouting of sailors adjusting sails and rigging. Breakfast, if you could call it that, consisted of hardtack biscuits that had to be soaked in beer or water to become remotely chewable, perhaps supplemented by a piece of salt pork that had been preserved in so much salt it was practically mummified. The hardtack deserves its own paragraph because it was such a fundamental part of the maritime diet and such a testament to human endurance. These biscuits were baked months before the voyage began, dried until they had the consistency of roof shingles, and stored in barrels where they slowly accumulated weevils, maggots, and other protein-rich additions that passengers learned to ignore or, in desperate times, consider a dietary supplement. Eating hardtack was less like consuming food and more like gnawing on edible furniture. Children aboard the ship faced particularly difficult circumstances. There were over 30 young people under the age of 16, including several infants who had been born just months before departure. These children had no space to run or play, no toys except what could fit in their families' tiny allocated areas, and no escape from the constant presence of adults who were themselves stressed, seasick, and increasingly irritable as the voyage dragged on week after week. The ship's daily schedule revolved around the needs of navigation and sail management. Passengers were expected to stay out of the way during critical operations, which meant spending most of their time huddled in the cramped space below deck. Twice a day, weather permitting, they were allowed on deck in small groups to get fresh air and exercise, though exercise consisted mainly of walking in tiny circles while trying not to fall overboard or get knocked down by a sudden roll of the ship. Religious observances continued throughout the voyage, because if you're going to suffer through 2 months of maritime misery, you might as well do it with proper spiritual guidance. The separatists held daily prayers and twice-weekly services, led by Elder William Brewster, who had to conduct worship in conditions that would challenge the most dedicated preacher. Imagine trying to deliver a sermon about divine providence while the floor beneath your feet is tilting at 30-degree angles and half your congregation is turning green around the gills. These religious services served multiple purposes beyond spiritual comfort. They provided structure to days that otherwise blended together in a haze of discomfort and boredom. They reinforced the community bonds that would be essential for survival in America. And they gave people something to focus on besides the very real possibility that they might all die before reaching their destination. The ship's water supply was another constant source of worry. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels, and despite careful rationing, the supply dwindled faster than expected. The water that remained grew increasingly stale and developed interesting flavors and textures as algae and bacteria made themselves at home. By the halfway point of the voyage, drinking water had become an act of faith as much as hydration. Medical care aboard the Mayflower was primitive even by 17th century standards. There was no doctor among the passengers, just a few people with basic knowledge of herbal remedies and prayer-based healing. When people became ill, which happened frequently in the crowded, unsanitary conditions, Treatment options were limited to bed rest, herbal teas, and hoping that whatever was wrong would resolve itself before it became fatal. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant that scurvy became a growing concern as the voyage progressed. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, began with fatigue and joint pain before progressing to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and skin problems that made sufferers look like they were slowly decomposing while still alive. Several passengers began showing early symptoms of scurvy before the ship reached America, a preview of the health challenges that would face the colony during their first winter. Accidents were another constant danger. The ship's deck was slippery when wet, which was most of the time, and the rigging presented numerous opportunities for people to injure themselves on ropes, pulleys, and wooden spars that swung unpredictably as the ship moved through heavy seas. One passenger, John Howland, fell overboard during a storm and was only saved when he managed to grab trailing ropes and was hauled back aboard by the crew, probably setting some kind of record for luckiest person in maritime history. The psychological toll of the voyage was perhaps as challenging as the physical hardships. Passengers were trapped together in close quarters with no privacy, no escape from personality conflicts, and no way to know how much longer their ordeal would continue. Some people handled the stress better than others, but everyone was affected by the constant uncertainty, discomfort, and fear that came with trusting their lives to a wooden ship crossing an ocean that seemed determined to kill them. Arguments and tensions arose frequently among the passengers, often over trivial matters that became magnified by stress and confinement. Disputes over sleeping spaces, food distribution, and personal belongings could escalate quickly in an environment where everyone was on edge. The ship's officers had to mediate conflicts between passengers, while also managing the complex task of keeping the vessel on course and in good repair. The Mayflower's crew consisted of about 30 professional sailors who knew their jobs but had little sympathy for passenger complaints. These men had signed on for what they thought would be a routine cargo run, not a 2-month voyage carrying over 100 landlubbers who got seasick, took up space, and generally made their work more difficult. The crew's attitude toward the passengers ranged from professional indifference to outright hostility, particularly when passengers interfered with ship operations or made unreasonable demands. Captain Christopher Jones found himself in the difficult position of balancing the needs of his paying passengers with the requirements of safe navigation. He was responsible for everyone aboard the ship, but his primary loyalty was to his crew and his vessel. When conflicts arose between passenger comfort and maritime safety, safety always won, sometimes leading to heated arguments with passengers who didn't understand why they couldn't do certain things or go certain places on the ship. The ship's daily routine was governed by the watch system that divided the crew into groups working 4-hour shifts around the clock. Passengers gradually learned to recognize the rhythm of these watches, the changing of the guard marked by bells and shouted commands that echoed through the ship at all hours. Sleep became a precious commodity that had to be grabbed whenever possible, often interrupted by the sounds of sailors working overhead or the ship's motion becoming too violent to remain lying down. Food preparation was a communal activity that required careful coordination to avoid accidents. Cooking fires were only permitted in calm weather, and even then, only in designated areas with strict supervision. Most meals consisted of cold or barely warm food, prepared in advance during favorable conditions and stored in containers that passengers hoped would remain secure as the ship rolled and pitched through the swells. The ship's livestock didn't fare much better than the human passengers. Several pigs, chickens, and goats had been brought along to provide fresh meat and eggs during the voyage, but the animals suffered from seasickness, cramped conditions, and the constant motion, just like everyone else. The chicken eggs became a precious commodity, carefully rationed and often saved for children and pregnant women who needed the nutrition most. Laundry was essentially impossible during the voyage. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing clothes, and salt water didn't clean fabric effectively, while also leaving everything stiff and uncomfortable. Passengers wore the same garments for weeks at a time, occasionally airing them out on deck during good weather, but otherwise simply accepting that personal hygiene was a luxury they couldn't afford until they reached dry land. The ship's waste management system was primitive, but functional. Human waste was collected in buckets and emptied overboard when weather permitted, though during storms, this became impossible, and the smell below deck reached truly epic proportions. The crew had designated areas for relieving themselves, but passengers had to make do with shared facilities that were cleaned irregularly and often overflowed during rough weather. As October turned into November, the passengers began to realize that their journey was taking much longer than originally planned. Food supplies that had been calculated for a 6-week voyage were now being stretched to cover 2 months or more, and rationing became increasingly strict. The daily allocation of food was reduced several times, leaving everyone constantly hungry and increasingly anxious about whether supplies would last until they reached America. The uncertainty about their destination added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. The passengers had originally planned to land somewhere near the mouth of the Hudson River, in territory controlled by the Virginia Company, where they had legal permission to establish a colony. But navigation errors and unfavorable winds were pushing them farther north, toward the coast of what would become Massachusetts, where they had no legal right to settle and no idea what kind of reception they might receive. The weather in late October and early November grew increasingly hostile, as if the Atlantic Ocean had decided to personally test every passenger's commitment to their transatlantic adventure. Storms that had seemed dramatic in September now felt apocalyptic, with waves tall enough to block out the sky and winds that howled through the rigging like banshees having a particularly bad day. The ship would climb these mountainous swells for what felt like hours, passengers clinging to whatever they could grab, before plummeting down the other side in a stomach-dropping descent that left everyone wondering if this was the moment the Mayflower would finally give up and sink. During these storms, the crew would batten down the hatches, literally sealing the passengers below deck in what amounted to a floating coffin. The gun deck became a nightmare of darkness, stale air, and human misery. Lanterns couldn't be lit safely during rough weather, so families huddled together in complete blackness, listening to the terrifying sounds of the ship being battered by forces that seemed determined to tear it apart. The wooden hull groaned and creaked, with sounds that suggested the vessel was having serious structural conversations with itself about whether to continue existing. Children cried constantly during these storms, and honestly, who could blame them? Adults wanted to cry too, but social conventions and Puritan stoicism prevented most open displays of fear, even when fear was the most rational response to their situation. Instead, they prayed, loudly and frequently, creating a soundtrack of desperate appeals to divine providence that competed with the howling wind and crashing waves for sheer volume. The ship's motion during these storms defied description. It wasn't just rolling from side to side or pitching forward and backward. The Mayflower seemed to move in directions that physics hadn't invented yet, corkscrewing through the water in ways that left passengers convinced they were experiencing some new form of three-dimensional seasickness. People who had managed to keep food down for days would suddenly find themselves contributing to the ship's already impressive collection of unpleasant odors. Between storms, when the weather calmed to merely miserable instead of apocalyptic, passengers would emerge from below deck looking like survivors of some maritime disaster, which, to be fair, they essentially were. The fresh air, even when it was cold and damp, felt like a gift from heaven after hours of breathing the concentrated essence of human suffering that had accumulated in the ship's lower levels. The crew used these calmer periods to make repairs and adjustments to the ship's rigging and sails, work that required considerable skill and courage as sailors climbed high into the masts while the ship continued to roll and pitch. Passengers watched these activities with a mixture of admiration and terror, realizing that their lives depended on men who seemed to treat climbing around on slippery ropes 100 feet above a churning ocean as just another day at the office. Food rationing became increasingly severe as November progressed, and it became clear that the voyage would take much longer than anyone had anticipated. The daily portions of salt pork were reduced to slivers that barely qualified as meat, and the hardtack biscuits, already inedible under the best circumstances, were now distributed with the careful precision usually reserved for distributing precious gems. Beer remained the primary beverage, but even that was being rationed more strictly, leaving everyone slightly dehydrated and significantly grumpy. The ship's rats, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. These uninvited passengers had apparently packed their own provisions and were conducting their own parallel society in the ship's lower reaches, occasionally making appearances that sent already stressed humans into fits of shrieking that added to the general chaos. The rats showed remarkable adaptability to maritime life, scampering across tilting surfaces with the confidence of experienced sailors, while the human passengers struggled to walk in a straight line. Personal relationships aboard the ship underwent significant strain as the voyage dragged on. People who had been friends and neighbors in Leiden found themselves snapping at each other over trivial matters, like someone taking up too much space or breathing too loudly. Married couples discovered new things about their spouses' personalities, particularly their spouse's ability to remain pleasant while seasick, hungry, and trapped in a wooden box with 100 other people for 2 months. The children aboard the ship adapted to their circumstances with the remarkable resilience that children somehow possess, turning the confined space into an adventure playground and inventing games that worked within the constraints of constant motion and limited space. They played quiet games during storms and more active games during calm weather, always under the watchful eyes of adults who were terrified that a child might fall overboard or get injured in the ship's dangerous environment. Elder William Brewster continued to lead religious services throughout the voyage, though his sermons had evolved to address the specific challenges of their situation. His messages about divine providence and the rewards awaiting the faithful in the promised land took on new urgency when delivered to an audience that was beginning to wonder if they would live to see any promised land at all. The hymns sung during these services had a particularly poignant quality when performed by voices hoarse from seasickness and fear. The ship's compass became an object of intense fascination for passengers who had never given much thought to navigation. Captain Jones would occasionally allow small groups to observe him taking readings and calculating their position, though his explanations of longitude and latitude were largely incomprehensible to people whose previous travel experience had been limited to walking between villages. The passengers gradually learned to read the crew's mood and behavior for clues about their progress and situation. Medical emergencies became increasingly common as the voyage wore on, and the passengers' health deteriorated from poor nutrition, lack of exercise, and constant stress. Several people developed serious respiratory ailments from breathing the damp, stale air below deck, and others suffered injuries from falls during rough weather. The ship's limited medical supplies were carefully hoarded for the most serious cases, leaving minor ailments to resolve themselves or worsen according to fate's whims. The lack of privacy aboard the ship created tensions that went far beyond mere inconvenience. Families accustomed to their own homes and personal space found themselves living in conditions that would challenge the patience of saints, which was ironic considering that half the passengers actually called themselves saints. Marital intimacy became essentially impossible, and even basic personal needs, like changing clothes or conducting private conversations, required careful planning and timing. Water continued to be a source of constant anxiety as the ship's supplies dwindled and what remained grew increasingly unpalatable. The water stored in wooden barrels developed flavors and textures that defied description, though passengers learned to drink it anyway because the alternative was dehydration. Some enterprising individuals tried filtering the water through cloth, which helped remove the visible particles, but did nothing about the taste, which resembled a combination of old wood, stagnant pond water, and despair. The ship's daily routine became a careful balance between essential activities and simply staying out of the way of the crew's work. Passengers learned to recognize the sounds that indicated when they needed to clear certain areas quickly, and they developed an informal system of taking turns on deck during the brief periods when weather permitted fresh air and exercise. These moments of relative freedom became precious beyond measure. Sleep patterns deteriorated as the voyage continued, with most passengers existing in a state of chronic exhaustion punctuated by brief periods of unconsciousness rather than actual rest. The constant motion of the ship made comfortable sleep nearly impossible, and the sounds of creaking wood, shouting sailors, crying children, and retching passengers created a nighttime symphony that would have impressed composers who specialized in depicting hell. The ship's livestock situation became increasingly dire as animals died from stress, seasickness, and inadequate nutrition. The surviving chickens produced fewer eggs, and the pigs and goats that had been intended to provide fresh meat during the voyage were clearly suffering as much as their human companions. Some passengers began to question the wisdom of bringing animals on such a journey, though others argued that any source of fresh food was worth preserving. As November progressed and the ship continued its seemingly endless journey across the Atlantic, passengers began to develop a kind of maritime fatalism. They had passed the point where turning back was feasible, even if they had wanted to, and their only choice was to continue forward toward whatever awaited them in America. This acceptance brought a strange kind of peace to some people, while others became increasingly anxious about their unknown destination and uncertain future. The crew's attitude toward the passengers had evolved from initial annoyance to grudging respect for their endurance, though professional tensions remained high. The sailors recognized that the passengers were showing remarkable resilience under circumstances that would have broken many people, but they also knew that their own survival depended on maintaining discipline and focusing on the technical challenges of navigation and ship management. Captain Jones found himself making increasingly difficult decisions about balancing passenger welfare against maritime safety. When storms threatened, he had to choose between keeping passengers below deck in miserable conditions or allowing them on deck where they might be injured or swept overboard. When food and water ran low, he had to decide how to distribute scarce resources fairly while maintaining enough reserves for emergencies. The psychological impact of uncertainty became as challenging as the physical hardships. Passengers had no way of knowing exactly where they were, how much farther they had to travel, or when their ordeal would end. This uncertainty created a unique form of stress that affected everyone differently. Some people became more religious, others more irritable, and a few seemed to retreat into themselves entirely, conserving their emotional energy for whatever challenges lay ahead. The ship's waste management problems intensified as the voyage continued, and the weather prevented regular cleaning and disposal of refuse. The smell below deck reached levels that challenged human endurance, and passengers had to breathe through cloth or simply accept that their olfactory senses would be permanently damaged by the experience. The crew regularly threatened to throw particularly troublesome passengers overboard, though whether these threats were serious or just stress-induced humor remained unclear. Navigation became increasingly critical as Captain Jones realized they were approaching the North American coast, but weren't entirely sure where. The charts available in 1620 were reasonably accurate for well-known European waters, but became increasingly unreliable as ships traveled farther from established trade routes. The captain had to rely on dead reckoning, celestial observations when weather permitted, and his own experience to determine their position. The passengers began to show signs of what would later be recognized as psychological trauma from their prolonged ordeal. People who had been stable and reliable community members in Leiden became unpredictable, prone to sudden outbursts of anger or despair. The constant stress of survival, combined with malnutrition and exhaustion, was taking a toll that went far beyond mere physical discomfort. Religious faith became both a source of comfort and a source of conflict, as different passengers, interpreted their suffering in different ways. Some saw their hardships as divine testing that would be rewarded with success in America. Others began to question whether their decision to leave Europe had been a terrible mistake that God was punishing them for. These theological debates added another layer of tension to an already stressful situation. The ship's structural integrity became a growing concern as the constant battering from storms began to take its toll on the wooden hull and rigging. Crew members spent increasing amounts of time on repairs and maintenance, work that required them to ignore passenger needs while focusing on keeping the vessel seaworthy. The passengers could hear the sounds of hammering and sawing as the crew worked to address problems that they couldn't see but could certainly worry about. By the middle of November, after more than 2 months at sea, the Mayflower's passengers had been transformed by their experience into something quite different from the hopeful emigrants who had departed from England. They had developed a kind of grim endurance, an ability to survive conditions that would have seemed unimaginable when their journey began. They had learned to sleep while standing up, to eat food that barely qualified as edible, and to maintain their sanity while trapped in circumstances that tested every limit of human endurance. The children aboard the ship had adapted perhaps better than the adults, showing the remarkable flexibility that young people possess when faced with extraordinary circumstances. They had invented games that could be played in tiny spaces, learned to sleep through storms that terrified their parents, and somehow maintained the kind of optimism that adults found increasingly difficult to sustain. The relationship between the saints and the strangers had evolved throughout the voyage, with shared suffering creating bonds that transcended the religious and social differences that had seemed so important when the journey began. People who might never have spoken to each other under normal circumstances found themselves depending on each other for emotional support and practical assistance. The ship's bell system, which divided the day into manageable chunks of maritime misery, had become the only reliable way to track time in a world where days blended together like ingredients in a particularly unappetizing stew. 8 bells marked the end of each 4-hour watch, and passengers learned to count these chimes like prisoners marking days on a cell wall, though instead of scratching marks in stone, they were mentally cataloging new varieties of discomfort and despair. The Mayflower's cargo hold had transformed into something resembling an underground city designed by someone who actively disliked human beings. Families had created tiny territories using hanging blankets and carefully arranged possessions, establishing boundaries that were respected with the kind of diplomatic precision usually reserved for international treaties. Stepping into someone else's designated space, even accidentally, could trigger conflicts that seemed wildly disproportionate to the offense but made perfect sense when you considered that personal space had become more valuable than gold. The ship's rats had apparently organized themselves into a parallel society that was functioning considerably better than the human community. These furry stowaways had established efficient supply chains, effective territorial agreements, and what appeared to be a functioning waste management system. Passengers occasionally caught glimpses of rats conducting their business with a level of organization and purpose that was frankly embarrassing when compared to the human passengers' increasing descent into barely controlled chaos. Captain Jones had developed the kind of weathered patience that comes from spending decades dealing with the ocean's personal vendetta against human ambition. He would stand at the ship's wheel, squinting at horizons that looked identical day after day, making navigational calculations that involved more guesswork than anyone wanted to admit. His crew respected him because he had successfully guided ships across the Atlantic before, though none of those previous voyages had involved transporting over 100 people who seemed determined to make his job as difficult as possible. The ship's drinking water had evolved into something that challenged the definition of liquid refreshment. What had started as merely stale water had progressed through various stages of biological creativity, developing colors and textures that suggested it was conducting its own experiments in spontaneous life generation. Passengers learned to drink it quickly without breathing through their noses, and to follow it immediately with whatever food was available to mask the aftertaste that lingered like a reminder of poor life choices. Seasickness had become a constant companion that passengers learned to manage rather than cure. Some people discovered that staying on deck helped, despite the cold and damp, while others found that lying perfectly still in the darkest corner they could find provided some relief. A few unfortunate souls seemed to be locked in permanent battle with their digestive systems, creating sounds and smells that added new dimensions to the ship's already impressive collection of unpleasant sensory experiences. The ship's laundry situation had progressed beyond mere inconvenience into the realm of public health concern. Passengers wore the same clothes for weeks at a time, occasionally attempting to air them out during brief periods of decent weather, but mostly just accepting that personal hygiene was a luxury they couldn't afford until they reached dry land. The collective aroma below deck had reached levels that made breathing through the mouth a survival strategy rather than a choice. Religious services continued throughout the voyage, though Elder Brewster's sermons had taken on increasingly creative interpretations of divine providence. It's one thing to preach about God's plan when you're standing in a comfortable church in Leiden, and quite another to maintain theological optimism while delivering your message to an audience that's seasick, hungry, and beginning to question whether the Almighty might have better things to do than guide their particular wooden bucket across an apparently endless ocean. The ship's children had adapted to their circumstances with the kind of resilience that made adults simultaneously proud and slightly envious. They had invented games that could be played while sitting down, learned to sleep through storms that kept their parents awake praying, and somehow maintained the kind of curiosity about their adventure that their elders found increasingly difficult to sustain. Watching children adapt to circumstances that challenged adult endurance provided both inspiration and a sobering reminder of what they were asking these young people to endure. The Mayflower's daily routine had settled into a rhythm that was monotonous, uncomfortable, and occasionally terrifying, like a very boring nightmare that occasionally featured special guest appearances by mortal terror. Passengers woke to the sound of sailors adjusting rigging, spent their days trying to stay out of the crew's way while finding ways to occupy their minds, and went to sleep, hoping that tomorrow might bring some sign that their journey was progressing toward an actual destination rather than simply continuing forever. Food distribution had become a carefully choreographed ritual that involved precise measurements, detailed record keeping, and the kind of diplomatic negotiations usually reserved for international trade agreements. Every scrap of salt pork was accounted for, every hardtack biscuit carefully rationed, and every drop of beer distributed with mathematical precision. The passengers had learned to eat slowly, making each meal last as long as possible, partly to savor what little food they had, and partly because there wasn't much else to do with their time. The ship's medical situation had evolved from concerning to genuinely frightening as passengers began showing symptoms of malnutrition and various ailments related to their living conditions. Several people had developed persistent coughs from breathing the damp, stale air below deck, and others showed early signs of scurvy, though most passengers wouldn't have recognized these symptoms, even if they had access to medical knowledge that wouldn't be developed for another century. Navigation remained a constant source of anxiety for both crew and passengers, though for different reasons. The crew worried about technical challenges, like determining their exact position and avoiding hazards, while the passengers worried about more fundamental questions, like whether they were still heading in the right direction and whether their captain actually knew where they were going. Captain Jones maintained an air of professional confidence, but even he was privately concerned about their extended time at sea and the challenges of finding their intended destination. The ship's social dynamics had evolved in ways that would have fascinated anthropologists if anthropology had been invented yet. Hierarchies based on religious conviction, social status, and family connections had given way to new arrangements based on practical considerations like who could keep food down during storms, who had useful skills for shipboard life, and who could maintain their sanity under circumstances that seemed designed to break human spirits. The saints and strangers had found common ground in their shared misery, discovering that theological differences seemed less important when everyone was equally seasick, hungry, and trapped in the same floating wooden box. People who might never have spoken under normal circumstances found themselves depending on each other for emotional support, practical assistance, and the kind of dark humor that emerges when people face circumstances so difficult that laughing becomes the only alternative to crying. The ship's waste management challenges had reached epic proportions, creating sanitation problems that would have been considered serious, even by 17th century standards, which were notably undemanding when it came to cleanliness. The crew had to balance the needs of keeping passengers healthy against the practical limitations of managing human waste on a ship that was constantly in motion and frequently battered by storms that made normal disposal methods impossible. Personal privacy had become a memory from their previous lives, something that passengers remembered fondly but no longer expected to experience. Families had learned to conduct private conversations in whispers, to change clothes with the skill of professional magicians, and to pretend they couldn't hear or see things that would have been shocking under normal circumstances, but had become routine aspects of shipboard life. The ship's structural integrity remained a constant background concern that passengers tried not to think about too much. The Mayflower was a sturdy vessel, built to carry cargo across the Atlantic, but it was being asked to perform duties it wasn't designed for while carrying a human cargo that created challenges no ship designer had anticipated. The crew spent increasing amounts of time on maintenance and repairs, work that required them to focus on technical problems, while passengers worried about whether those problems might be more serious than anyone was admitting. Sleep had become something passengers grabbed whenever possible rather than something they expected to enjoy. The constant motion of the ship, combined with the sounds of creaking wood, shouting sailors, and fellow passengers dealing with various forms of distress, created a nighttime environment that challenged even the most exhausted person in his ability to rest. Most passengers existed in a state of chronic sleep deprivation that affected their judgment, their patience, and their ability to cope with the daily challenges of shipboard life. The ship's livestock situation had deteriorated to the point where the surviving animals seemed to be suffering as much as their human companions. The chickens had stopped laying eggs with any regularity. The pigs appeared to be experiencing their own version of seasickness, and the goats had developed the 1,000-yard stare that suggested they were questioning their life choices just as much as everyone else aboard the ship. Weather continued to be the dominant factor in daily life aboard the Mayflower, determining everything from meal schedules to religious services to basic safety. Fair weather was celebrated like a holiday, providing opportunities for fresh air, exercise, and the kind of routine maintenance that kept both ship and passengers functioning. Storms were endured with the grim determination of people who had learned that complaining about circumstances beyond their control was a waste of energy they couldn't afford to spend. The ship's crew had developed a grudging respect for their passengers' endurance, though professional tensions remained high. The sailors recognized that the people they were transporting were showing remarkable resilience under circumstances that would have broken many individuals, but they also knew that their own survival depended on maintaining discipline and focusing on the technical challenges of keeping the ship moving toward its destination. Captain Jones found himself making increasingly difficult decisions about resource allocation, safety protocols, and passenger management. Every choice involved trade-offs between competing needs and priorities, and he had to balance the welfare of his passengers against the practical requirements of maritime survival. His decisions were often unpopular with people who didn't understand the complex factors he had to consider, but he had the experience to know that popularity was less important than keeping everyone alive. The psychological toll of the voyage had begun to manifest in ways that went beyond simple irritability or homesickness. Some passengers had developed what would later be recognized as symptoms of depression and anxiety, though 17th century understanding of mental health was limited to concepts like melancholy and spiritual affliction. People who had been stable community members in Leiden were showing signs of emotional strain that concerned their friends and family members. The ship's daily schedule had evolved to accommodate the reality that normal human activities required creative adaptation to shipboard conditions. Meal preparation, personal hygiene, religious observances, and even basic conversations had to be planned around the crew's work schedule, weather conditions, and the constant motion that made simple tasks surprisingly challenging. Food preparation had become an exercise in creative problem solving that would have impressed professional chefs if professional chefs had existed in recognizable form. Passengers had learned to prepare meals that could be eaten safely during rough weather, to preserve food in conditions that encouraged rapid spoilage, and to make hardtack and salt pork palatable enough to sustain life, if not actually enjoyable to consume. The ship's social hierarchy continued to evolve as the voyage progressed, and passengers discovered that their previous assumptions about leadership, authority, and social status didn't necessarily apply to their current circumstances. People emerged as natural leaders based on their ability to remain calm during crises, their practical skills, or simply their capacity to maintain morale when everyone else was struggling with despair. The relationship between passengers and crew had settled into a pattern of mutual dependence mixed with mutual irritation. The passengers needed the crew's expertise to reach their destination safely, while the crew needed the passengers' cooperation to manage the ship effectively. Neither group was entirely happy with the arrangement, but both recognized that their survival depended on working together, despite their differences. The ship's navigation challenges intensified as they approached what they hoped was the North American coast, but couldn't be entirely certain about their exact position. Captain Jones was using every technique available to 17th century maritime navigation, but the tools and methods of the time left considerable room for uncertainty, especially after such an extended voyage across poorly charted waters. Religious faith remained a source of both comfort and conflict among the passengers, as they interpreted their suffering in different ways. Some saw their hardships as divine testing that would be rewarded with success in America, while others began to question whether their decision to leave Europe had been a terrible mistake. These theological debates added intellectual content to conversations that might otherwise have focused entirely on their physical discomfort and practical concerns. The ship's rats had become so well established in their parallel society that some passengers had begun to regard them with a kind of grudging respect. These uninvited stowaways had adapted to shipboard life with remarkable success, showing levels of organization and resourcefulness that compared favorably to the human passengers' own efforts at community building. Personal relationships aboard the ship continued to evolve under the pressure of constant proximity and shared hardship. Friendships deepened in some cases and dissolved in others, while romantic relationships faced challenges that would have tested even the strongest bonds. Marriage aboard the Mayflower required levels of patience, understanding, and creative problem solving that most couples had never imagined needing. The ship's children continued to show remarkable adaptability, treating their circumstances as an extended adventure rather than the ordeal their parents experienced. They had learned to play quiet games during storms, to sleep in conditions that would have challenged adult endurance, and to find entertainment in situations that offered few obvious sources of amusement. Medical emergencies became increasingly serious as the voyage continued and passengers' health deteriorated from poor nutrition, inadequate exercise, and constant stress. The ship's limited medical supplies were carefully rationed for the most critical cases, while minor ailments were left to resolve themselves or worsen according to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The ship's waste disposal problems had reached levels that challenged even 17th century standards of sanitation, which were notably relaxed compared to modern expectations. The crew had to develop increasingly creative solutions for managing human waste on a ship that was constantly in motion and frequently prevented from normal disposal methods by weather conditions. Water quality continued to deteriorate as the voyage progressed, and the ship's supplies aged under conditions that encouraged the growth of various forms of microscopic life. Passengers learned to drink quickly and follow their water intake with whatever food was available to mask flavors that defied pleasant description. The ship's daily routine had become a careful balance between essential activities and simply staying out of the crew's way while they managed the complex tasks required to keep the vessel moving toward its destination. Passengers had learned to recognize the sounds and activities that indicated when they needed to clear certain areas quickly and when they might have brief opportunities for fresh air and exercise. Sleep patterns had deteriorated to the point where most passengers existed in a state of chronic exhaustion, punctuated by brief periods of unconsciousness rather than actual rest. The constant motion, noise, and discomfort made quality sleep nearly impossible, affecting everyone's judgment, patience, and ability to cope with daily challenges. The ship's structural condition remained a source of background anxiety that passengers tried not to think about too directly. The Mayflower was showing signs of wear from the constant battering of Atlantic storms, and the crew spent increasing amounts of time on repairs and maintenance that kept the vessel seaworthy, but didn't address passengers' concerns about whether these problems might be more serious than anyone was admitting. By late November, after more than 2 months at sea, the passengers had been fundamentally changed by their experience. They had developed a kind of maritime stoicism, an ability to endure conditions that would have seemed impossible when their journey began. They had learned to find small pleasures in circumstances that offered few obvious sources of comfort, and to maintain hope when hope seemed like an increasingly irrational response to their situation. The transformation went beyond mere physical adaptation to harsh conditions. These people had been forced to discover reserves of strength, patience, and resilience they hadn't known they possessed. They had learned to depend on each other in ways that transcended their previous social and religious divisions, creating bonds that would prove essential for their survival in the challenges that awaited them in America. The collective mood aboard the Mayflower had evolved through several distinct phases during their extended maritime ordeal. What had begun as nervous excitement mixed with religious fervor had progressed through seasickness and discomfort into something approaching grim acceptance. By late November, the passengers had developed what could only be described as maritime fatalism, a recognition that they had passed the point of no return and could only continue forward toward whatever awaited them on the far side of the Atlantic. This psychological adaptation was perhaps as remarkable as their physical endurance. People who had lived comfortable, predictable lives in Leiden had learned to function in an environment where nothing was certain except constant motion and the daily struggle to maintain basic human dignity. They had discovered that human beings could adapt to circumstances that seemed impossible, though the cost of that adaptation was measured in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until much later. The ship's social dynamics had crystallized into patterns that would influence the future colony in ways the passengers couldn't yet imagine. Natural leaders had emerged based not on their previous status or religious authority, but on their ability to remain calm during crises, solve practical problems, and maintain morale when circumstances seemed hopeless. These leadership qualities, forged in the cramped, stinking hold of a storm-battered ship, would prove essential for survival in the wilderness of New England. Meanwhile, the crew continued their professional duties with the kind of weathered competence that comes from years of dealing with the ocean's personal vendetta against human ambition. They had seen passengers before, though never quite so many or for quite so long, and they had developed a grudging respect for these particular landlubbers who had shown remarkable resilience under circumstances that would have broken lesser individuals. Captain Jones spent his days calculating and recalculating their position, using methods that combined scientific observation with educated guesswork in proportions he preferred not to discuss with his passengers. The charts available in 1620 were reasonably accurate for well-traveled European waters, but became increasingly speculative as ships ventured into the less familiar reaches of the North Atlantic. He was confident they were approaching the American coast, but exactly where remained a question that would be answered by geography rather than navigation. The ship's daily rhythm had settled into a pattern that was simultaneously monotonous and unpredictable. The routine activities of eating, sleeping, and trying to maintain basic hygiene were constantly interrupted by weather events that transformed their floating wooden home into something resembling a carnival ride designed by someone with a grudge against human comfort. Passengers had learned to secure their possessions and themselves whenever the barometric pressure began to drop and the crew started making those purposeful movements that indicated an incoming storm. Food continued to be a source of constant concern as rationing became increasingly strict and the remaining supplies developed creative new flavors and textures. The hardtack had achieved a consistency that challenged the definition of edible matter, requiring soaking in beer or water before it could be consumed without risking dental damage. The salt pork had been preserved with such thoroughness that it resembled leather more than meat, though passengers had learned to appreciate any source of protein, regardless of its original species or current palatability. The ship's water supply had evolved into something that tested the limits of human determination. What had started as merely stale drinking water had progressed through various stages of biological creativity, developing characteristics that suggested it was conducting its own experiments in spontaneous life generation. Passengers learned to drink it quickly, without breathing through their noses, and to follow it immediately with whatever food was available to mask the aftertaste that lingered like a persistent reminder of their circumstances. Personal hygiene had become a memory from their previous lives, something that passengers recalled fondly, but no longer expected to experience until they reached dry land. The ship's limited freshwater supplies were too precious to waste on washing, and saltwater cleaning left everything stiff and uncomfortable while adding new layers of salt to skin that was already irritated from constant dampness and rough clothing. The children aboard the ship continued to adapt with remarkable resilience, treating their circumstances as an extended adventure rather than the ordeal their parents experienced. They had invented games that could be played in minimal space, learned to sleep through conditions that kept adults awake, and somehow maintained the kind of curiosity about their situation that their elders found increasingly difficult to sustain. Religious observances continued throughout the voyage, Though Elder Brewster's sermons had taken on increasingly creative interpretations of divine providence and the mysterious ways in which the Almighty chose to test the faithful. It's one thing to preach about God's plan when you're standing in a comfortable church, and quite another to maintain theological optimism while delivering your message to an audience that's questioning whether divine guidance might have better things to do than navigate their particular wooden bucket across an apparently endless ocean. The relationship between the saints and the strangers had evolved significantly during their shared ordeal. Religious and social differences that had seemed important when the journey began had given way to bonds forged through mutual suffering and dependence. People who might never have spoken under normal circumstances found themselves relying on each other for emotional support, practical assistance, and the kind of dark humor that emerges when human beings face circumstances so challenging that laughter becomes the only alternative to despair. The ship's structural integrity remained a background concern that passengers tried not to contemplate too directly. The Mayflower was a sturdy vessel built to carry cargo across the Atlantic, but it was being asked to perform duties it wasn't designed for while enduring weather conditions that tested every joint and timber. The crew spent increasing amounts of time on maintenance and repairs, work that required them to focus on technical problems, while passengers wondered whether those problems might be more serious than anyone was willing to admit. Navigation became increasingly critical as Captain Jones realized they were definitely approaching the North American coast, but remained uncertain about their exact location. The tools and methods available in 1620 left considerable room for error, especially after such an extended voyage across waters that were imperfectly charted at best. Dead reckoning, celestial observations when weather permitted, and the captain's own experience were the primary methods for determining their position, and all three had limitations that became more significant as the voyage continued. The ship's medical situation had deteriorated to genuinely concerning levels as passengers began showing symptoms of malnutrition and various ailments related to their living conditions. Several people had developed persistent respiratory problems from breathing the damp, stale air below deck, while others showed early signs of scurvy, though most passengers wouldn't have recognized these symptoms even if they had access to medical knowledge that wouldn't be developed for another century. Sleep had become something passengers attempted rather than something they expected to achieve. The constant motion of the ship, combined with the sounds of creaking wood, working sailors, and fellow passengers dealing with various forms of distress, created a nighttime environment that challenged even the most exhausted person's ability to rest. Most passengers existed in a state of chronic sleep deprivation that affected their judgment, patience, and ability to cope with the daily challenges of shipboard life. The ship's waste management problems had reached epic proportions, creating sanitation challenges that would have been considered serious even by 17th century standards. The crew had to develop increasingly creative solutions for managing human waste on a vessel that was constantly in motion and frequently prevented from normal disposal methods by weather conditions that made venturing on deck dangerous or impossible. The collective psychological state of the passengers had evolved into something that combined resignation with determination, acceptance of their circumstances, with hope for eventual deliverance. They had learned to find small pleasures in situations that offered few obvious sources of comfort, to maintain dignity in conditions that seemed designed to strip away human grace, and to support each other when individual strength seemed insufficient for the challenges they faced. The ship's rats had become so well established in their parallel community that some passengers regarded them with grudging respect. These uninvited stowaways had adapted to maritime life with remarkable success, showing levels of organization and resourcefulness that compared favorably to the human passengers' own efforts at survival and community building. Personal relationships aboard the ship continued to evolve under the constant pressure of proximity and shared hardship. Friendships that had seemed solid in Leiden discovered new strains and strengths, while romantic relationships faced challenges that tested the limits of patience, understanding, and creative problem solving. Marriage aboard the Mayflower required levels of compromise and adaptation that most couples had never imagined needing. The ship's daily schedule had become a carefully choreographed dance between essential human activities and the practical requirements of keeping the vessel moving toward its destination. Passengers had learned to recognize the sounds and movements that indicated when they needed to clear certain areas quickly, when they might have brief opportunities for fresh air and exercise, and when they should simply find secure positions and wait for whatever crisis was developing to resolve itself. Food preparation had evolved into an exercise in creative problem solving that would have impressed professional chefs if professional chefs had existed in recognizable form. Passengers had learned to prepare meals that could be consumed safely during rough weather, to preserve food in conditions that encouraged rapid spoilage, and to make hardtack and salt pork palatable enough to sustain life, even if actual enjoyment remained beyond reach. The ship's social hierarchy had been completely restructured by their shared experience. Previous assumptions about leadership, authority, and social status had given way to new arrangements based on practical considerations like who could maintain calm during emergencies, who possessed useful skills for shipboard survival, and who could sustain morale when circumstances seemed designed to break human spirits. Weather remained the dominant factor in every aspect of daily life aboard the Mayflower. Fair weather was celebrated like a religious holiday, providing opportunities for fresh air, exercise, and the kind of routine maintenance that kept both the ship and passengers functioning. Storms were endured with the grim determination of people who had learned that complaining about circumstances beyond their control was a waste of energy they couldn't afford to spend. The ship's livestock situation had become increasingly dire as the surviving animals showed signs of suffering that mirrored their human companions' distress. The chickens had largely stopped producing eggs. The pigs appeared to be experiencing their own version of seasickness, and the goats had developed the 1,000-yard stare that suggested they were questioning their life choices just as much as everyone else aboard the vessel. By the end of November, after more than 2.5 months at sea, the passengers had been fundamentally transformed by their experience. They had developed a kind of maritime stoicism, an ability to endure conditions that would have seemed impossible when their journey began. They had learned to depend on each other in ways that transcended their previous social and religious divisions, creating bonds that would prove essential for survival in the challenges that awaited them in America. The transformation went far beyond mere physical adaptation to harsh conditions. These people had been forced to discover reserves of strength, patience, and resilience they hadn't known they possessed. They had learned that human beings could adapt to almost any circumstances, though the cost of that adaptation was measured in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until much later. Captain Jones continued to study his charts and instruments, calculating their progress with the kind of professional attention to detail that had kept him alive through decades of ocean travel. He was increasingly confident that they were approaching the North American coast, though exactly where remained a question that would be answered by geography rather than navigation. The passengers, meanwhile, had moved beyond asking when they might arrive to simply accepting that their journey would end when it ended and not before. The collective experience aboard the Mayflower had created something unprecedented in the passengers' lives, a community forged through shared suffering and mutual dependence. The bonds formed during those months at sea would influence the development of their future colony in ways that none of them could yet imagine. They had learned to function as a group under the most challenging circumstances possible, skills that would prove essential for survival in the wilderness of New England. The ship's daily routine had become as predictable as anything could be in an environment dominated by unpredictable weather and constant motion. Passengers woke to the sound of the ship's bell and the activities of the crew adjusting sails and rigging. They spent their days trying to stay out of the way while finding ways to occupy their minds and maintain their sanity. They went to sleep, hoping that tomorrow might bring some sign of progress toward their destination, though they had learned not to expect dramatic changes in their circumstances. The psychological impact of their extended voyage had created a unique form of community consciousness. These people had shared experiences that would bind them together for the rest of their lives, regardless of whatever other differences might emerge in their future colony. They had seen each other at their worst and their best, had depended on each other for survival, and had learned that individual success was impossible without group cooperation. Religious faith remained a central organizing principle for the community, though the practical challenges of their situation had modified some of their theological perspectives. The abstract concepts of divine providence and predestination had taken on immediate, practical meanings when applied to questions of daily survival and the hope for eventual deliverance from their oceanic ordeal. The ship's crew had developed their own perspective on the passengers' experience, recognizing the remarkable resilience these landlubbers had shown under circumstances that would have broken many people. The professional sailors had seen passenger voyages before, but never quite like this one, and they had gained a grudging respect for people who had endured months of maritime misery without completely losing their minds or their determination to reach their destination. As November drew to a close and the Mayflower continued its seemingly endless journey across the North Atlantic, the passengers had settled into a kind of suspended animation, existing day by day without the luxury of knowing when their ordeal might end. They had learned to find meaning in small victories and temporary improvements in their circumstances, while maintaining hope for eventual deliverance that had become more a matter of faith than rational expectation. The experience had stripped away many of the social conventions and personal pretenses that had structured their previous lives, revealing fundamental aspects of human character that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. Some people had discovered reserves of strength and leadership they hadn't known they possessed, while others had found that their previous sources of identity and self-worth were less reliable than they had believed. The ship itself had become more than just a means of transportation. It had become a world unto itself, with its own social dynamics, economic systems, and survival strategies. The passengers had learned to think of the Mayflower not as a temporary inconvenience, but as their entire universe, a floating community that contained everything they needed to sustain life, even if that life was far from comfortable or predictable. The bonds formed during their shared ordeal would influence every aspect of their future colony, from political structures to social relationships to economic arrangements. They had learned to function as a community under the most challenging circumstances imaginable, and those lessons would prove invaluable when they faced the different but equally demanding challenges of establishing a settlement in the New England wilderness. As the ship continued its steady progress toward whatever awaited them on the far shore of the Atlantic, the passengers had achieved something remarkable. They had survived an experience that tested every limit of human endurance and emerged as a community capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Their journey was far from over, but they had already proven to themselves and each other that they possessed the resilience and determination necessary to build something new in the American wilderness. The weather in the final days of November seemed determined to provide one last test of the passengers' endurance, as if the Atlantic Ocean had been saving its most theatrical performance for the grand finale. Storms arrived with the regularity of a particularly vindictive alarm clock, each one bringing waves that seemed personally offended by the Mayflower's continued existence. The ship would climb these liquid mountains with the enthusiasm of a reluctant mountain climber, pause dramatically at the crest as if considering whether to continue this charade, then plummet down the other side in a manner that left passengers wondering whether gravity had always been quite so aggressive. The crew, meanwhile, had developed the kind of professional calm that comes from years of explaining to the ocean that human beings have places to be and schedules to keep. They scurried about the rigging with the confidence of squirrels who had made peace with the possibility of sudden death, adjusting sails and securing ropes, while passengers below deck tried to remember what solid ground felt like and whether their stomachs had always been quite so interested in relocating to different parts of their bodies. Captain Jones spent these final days studying his charts with the intensity of a scholar attempting to decode ancient mysteries, which, given the quality of 17th century navigation, wasn't entirely inaccurate. His calculations suggested they were approaching the North American coast, though exactly where remained a question that would be answered by bumping it into something solid rather than mathematical precision. The passengers had learned not to ask too many questions about their exact location, partly out of respect for the captain's expertise, and partly because they suspected the answers might involve more uncertainty than anyone was comfortable discussing. The ship's food supplies had reached levels that challenged even the most creative definitions of cuisine. The remaining hardtack had achieved a consistency that archaeologists would later find useful for understanding ancient building techniques, while the salt pork had been preserved so thoroughly that it could probably survive the next ice age without requiring additional treatment. Passengers had learned to approach meals with the kind of philosophical acceptance usually reserved for natural disasters, grateful for anything that provided calories while trying not to think too hard about texture, flavor, or the original species of whatever they were consuming. Water rationing had become an exercise in precision that would have impressed accountants if accountants had existed in recognizable form. Every drop was measured, recorded, and distributed with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for dividing precious gems among royalty. The remaining water had developed characteristics that defied pleasant description, though passengers had learned to consume it quickly while focusing their attention on more agreeable topics, like the possibility that they might someday again taste beverages that didn't require an act of will to swallow. The ship's waste management situation had progressed beyond mere inconvenience into the realm of biological warfare against human dignity. The crew had developed increasingly creative solutions for dealing with the accumulated results of human existence in confined spaces, though these solutions often involved waiting for weather conditions that made normal disposal methods possible without risking the loss of crew members to the Atlantic Ocean's apparent desire to collect maritime workers. Personal hygiene had become a fond memory from their previous lives, something passengers recalled with the kind of wistful nostalgia usually reserved for lost loves or abandoned dreams. The concept of washing with soap and clean water had taken on mythical qualities, like stories of unicorns or politicians who kept their promises. Passengers made do with occasional attempts to clean themselves with whatever materials were available, though these efforts were more symbolic than effective. The children aboard the ship continued to demonstrate the kind of adaptability that made adults simultaneously proud and slightly envious. They had learned to play games that required minimal space and maximum imagination, turning the ship's confined quarters into adventure playgrounds that existed primarily in their minds. Their ability to find entertainment in circumstances that challenged adult sanity provided both inspiration and a sobering reminder of human resilience when it hasn't yet learned to recognize impossible situations. Sleep had evolved from a basic human need into a complex negotiation between exhaustion and environment. The constant motion of the ship, combined with the sounds of creaking wood, working sailors, and fellow passengers conducting their own battles with comfort, created nighttime conditions that would have challenged professional insomniacs. Most passengers existed in a state of chronic tiredness, punctuated by brief moments of unconsciousness rather than actual rest, though even these fragments of sleep were precious beyond measure. The ship's social dynamics had crystallized into patterns that would influence their future colony in ways none of them could yet imagine. Natural leaders had emerged based not on their previous status or religious authority, but on their ability to remain functional during crises, solve practical problems, and maintain group morale when circumstances seemed designed to break human spirits. These leadership qualities, forged in the cramped quarters of a storm-battered ship, would prove essential for survival in the American wilderness. Religious observances continued throughout these final weeks, though Elder Brewster's sermons had taken on increasingly personal interpretations of divine providence and the mysterious ways in which the Almighty chose to test the faithful, delivering theological comfort to an audience that was questioning whether God's plan might have included slightly more comfortable transportation arrangements, required creative approaches to traditional scripture, and considerable faith in the congregation's ability to see the bigger picture. The relationship between saints and strangers had evolved into something resembling actual community, with religious and social differences giving way to bonds forged through shared suffering and mutual dependence. People who might never have spoken under normal circumstances found themselves relying on each other for emotional support, practical assistance, and the kind of gallows humor that emerges when human beings face circumstances so challenging that laughter becomes a survival strategy rather than simple entertainment. The ship's structural integrity remained a background concern that passengers tried not to contemplate too directly, like mortality or the possibility that they had made a terrible mistake in leaving Europe. The Mayflower was showing signs of wear from months of battering by Atlantic storms, and the crew spent increasing amounts of time on repairs and maintenance that kept the vessel seaworthy while raising questions about whether these problems might be more serious than anyone was willing to discuss openly. Medical emergencies had become routine events that tested the limits of shipboard healthcare, which consisted primarily of hoping that whatever was wrong would resolve itself before becoming fatal. Several passengers had developed serious respiratory ailments from breathing the damp, stale air below deck, while others showed symptoms of malnutrition and various conditions related to living in circumstances that challenged every aspect of human health and hygiene. The ship's livestock situation had deteriorated to the point where the surviving animals seemed to be conducting their own philosophical examination of their life choices. The chickens had largely abandoned egg production in favor of what appeared to be existential contemplation, while the pigs and goats had developed expressions that suggested they were questioning the wisdom of their association with human beings and their maritime adventures. Navigation became increasingly critical as Captain Jones realized they were definitely approaching something that might be the North American coast, though exactly what remained a question that would be answered by direct observation rather than mathematical calculation. The tools and methods available in 1620 left considerable room for interpretation, especially after such an extended voyage across waters that were imperfectly charted and subject to currents that seemed to have personal opinions about where ships should and shouldn't go. The collective psychological state of the passengers had evolved into something that combined resignation with determination, acceptance of their circumstances with hope for eventual deliverance. They had learned to find small pleasures in situations that offered few obvious sources of comfort, to maintain dignity in conditions that seemed designed to strip away human grace, and to support each other when individual strength seemed insufficient for the challenges they faced daily. Food preparation had become an exercise in creative problem solving that would have impressed professional chefs if professional chefs had existed in recognizable form. Passengers had learned to prepare meals that could be consumed safely during rough weather, to preserve food in conditions that encouraged rapid spoilage, and to make hardtack and salt pork palatable enough to sustain life, even if actual enjoyment remained a distant memory from their previous existence. The ship's daily schedule had become a carefully choreographed performance that balanced essential human activities with the practical requirements of keeping the vessel moving toward its destination. Passengers had learned to recognize the sounds and movements that indicated when they needed to clear certain areas quickly, when they might have brief opportunities for fresh air and exercise, and when they should simply secure themselves and wait for whatever crisis was developing to resolve itself. Personal relationships aboard the ship continued to evolve under the constant pressure of proximity and shared hardship. Friendships that had seemed solid in Leiden discovered new dimensions and challenges, while romantic relationships faced tests that required the levels of patience, understanding, and creative problem solving that most couples had never imagined needing. Marriage aboard the Mayflower had become an advanced course in human cooperation under extreme circumstances. The ship's rats had achieved a level of organization and success that some passengers found embarrassingly superior to their own community-building efforts. These uninvited stowaways had adapted to maritime life with remarkable efficiency, establishing supply chains, territorial agreements, and waste management systems that functioned considerably better than the human passengers' increasingly chaotic attempts at maintaining civilized society in uncivilized conditions. Weather remained the ultimate authority governing every aspect of life aboard the Mayflower. Fair weather was celebrated with the enthusiasm usually reserved for religious holidays, providing opportunities for fresh air, exercise, and the kind of routine maintenance that kept both ship and passengers functioning. Storms were endured with the grim determination of people who had learned that complaining about forces beyond their control was a luxury they couldn't afford. The ship's social hierarchy had been completely reconstructed by their shared experience, with previous assumptions about leadership, authority, and social status giving way to new arrangements based on practical considerations. Who could maintain calm during emergencies? Who possessed useful skills for shipboard survival? And who could sustain group morale when circumstances seemed designed to break human spirits, became the new measures of worth and influence. As December began, and the Mayflower continued its seemingly endless journey across the North Atlantic, the passengers had achieved something remarkable in human endurance. They had survived an experience that tested every limit of physical and psychological resilience, emerging as a community capable of facing whatever challenges awaited them on the far shore of the Atlantic Ocean. The bonds formed during their maritime ordeal would influence every aspect of their future colony, from political structures to social relationships to economic arrangements. They had learned to function as a unified group under the most challenging circumstances imaginable, developing skills and relationships that would prove invaluable when they faced the different but equally demanding task of establishing a permanent settlement in the New England wilderness. Their journey had transformed them from a collection of individuals with shared religious beliefs into something unprecedented, a community forged through shared suffering, mutual dependence, and the kind of collective determination that emerges when human beings discover they can survive circumstances that initially seemed impossible. The Mayflower had become more than transportation. It had become a crucible that tested and strengthened the human spirit in preparation for the challenges that lay ahead. And then, on November 19th, 1620, after 66 days at sea, someone spotted land. The cry went up from the lookout, cutting through the morning air like a knife through the constant background noise of wind and waves. "Land ho!" echoed across the deck, and suddenly every passenger who could move was struggling to reach the upper deck, to see with their own eyes the coastline that meant the end of their oceanic ordeal. What they saw was not the warm, welcoming shore they had imagined during their darkest moments at sea, but a cold, forbidding coastline covered with dense forest and backed by gray November skies. This was not the mouth of the Hudson River where they had planned to settle, but the tip of what would later be called Cape Cod, hundreds of miles north of their intended destination. The land looked harsh, uninviting, and utterly foreign to people who had spent their lives in the cultivated landscapes of Europe. But it was land, solid, unmoving, blessed land that promised an end to the constant motion that had defined their existence for over 2 months. The passengers wept, prayed, and embraced each other as they watched the coastline grow larger and more detailed. After weeks of wondering whether they would ever see anything but endless ocean, the sight of trees, rocks, and actual earth seemed like a miracle worthy of immediate thanksgiving. The Mayflower anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor, and for the first time in over 2 months, the ship was truly still. The sudden absence of constant motion felt almost unnatural to passengers who had learned to walk, sleep, and eat while constantly adjusting to the ship's movement. Standing on a deck that didn't roll or pitch took conscious effort, like learning to walk all over again. Captain Jones and the ship's officers faced immediate decisions about their situation. They were not where they had planned to be. They had no legal authority to establish a settlement in this location, and winter was approaching rapidly. The passengers, meanwhile, were simply grateful to have survived their journey and eager to set foot on dry land, regardless of where that land might be located or what challenges it might present. The first landing parties went ashore to search for fresh water and assess their situation, finding a landscape that was both beautiful and intimidating. The forests were thick and dark, the beaches were cold and windswept, and there were no signs of European civilization anywhere within sight. This was truly a new world, wild and untamed, waiting to test these survivors of the Atlantic crossing in entirely new ways. And so ended the maritime chapter of the Pilgrims' story, though their greatest challenges still lay ahead. They had crossed the ocean, survived circumstances that had tested every limit of human endurance, and emerged as a community capable of facing the unknown wilderness of New England. The Mayflower had delivered them safely to America, though not to the America they had planned to find. Their journey had taught them that human beings could adapt to almost any circumstances, that communities could be forged through shared hardship, and that faith, determination, and mutual support could carry people through ordeals that initially seemed impossible to survive. These lessons would serve them well in the months and years ahead, as they faced the equally daunting task of building a new life in a new world. The story of the Mayflower voyage remains one of history's great tales of human endurance and determination, a reminder that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demand it and when they support each other through the darkest hours. Their 66 days at sea had prepared them for whatever lay ahead, though they could never have imagined the full scope of the challenges and opportunities that awaited them on the shores of New England. And with that, dear sleepy historians, our maritime journey comes to an end. The Pilgrims had crossed the Atlantic, survived their floating wooden ordeal, and arrived in America ready to begin the next chapter of their remarkable story. Sleep well and dream of solid ground beneath your feet and fresh water that doesn't taste like it's been conducting biological experiments. Until next time, may your own journeys be considerably more comfortable than those of our hardy 17th century travelers.